Today I'll give you a talk that will give you basically the skeletal outlines of revolution in mind. It will take you through some of the deeper assumptions that organize the work for me, so that I hope even if you've read the book you'll find it interesting. Let me start with a little bit of autobiography and tell you why I became interested in writing this book. I was in New York in the 1990s, and at that point, when I became interested in the history of psychoanalysis, or symptomatically it was called the Freud studies, really, there were starting to be two very diametrically opposed views of the field. One, which had been established in the 1950s by Ernest Jones and a number of others, suggested that psychoanalysis was the brainchild of Sigmund Freud, who was, from his own creative genius and his clinical encounters, he created this discipline. He was also supposed to be very virtuous and pure, and of course this idealization led in the 1980s to a contrary portrait that said that Sigmund Freud was not only not creative, but an intellectual thief who stole many of his good ideas from others, wasn't particularly virtuous, and this was supposed to undermine the whole field. I didn't particularly feel that either of these were very interesting ways of looking at the questions I was interested in, which were really twofold. The questions I found interesting were, how did these ideas come together to create an attempted science of subjectivity? And that's the first question. And the second question, how did a community form around these ideas that then spread them throughout the world? So the first question is a question of intellectual history, of ideas and how they come together. The second question was a question of social history. And the reason I was interested in these was that I think they had, and they still have, very pressing import for us today. So I was interested in the main character of my book is the psychoanalytic field, not an individual. It's not Sigmund Freud. He's very, very important to this story. But it is how a field emerges with a coherent body of knowledge and social commitments that form it and also distort it. And I started to think about models to use to try to understand these questions that I've just proposed. And the first model, of course, would have been from Thomas Kuhn. The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Thomas Kuhn, as many of you will know, argued that science has a social component. It has paradigms which are assumed. They organize what's called normal science. People go about doing their studies without questioning those paradigms until so many anomalies accrue, so many things that can't be explained by this paradigm accrue, that there is a radical paradigm shift. This is the famous Kuhnian model of science. Now, although very intrigued by and influenced, frankly, by this model, I didn't want to employ it because I wasn't sure psychoanalysis actually worked the same way that the fields Kuhn studied, astronomy, physics, worked. In fact, it seemed to me that psychoanalysis could tolerate a great number of anomalies without paradigm shifts, and so I didn't want to presuppose the answer to that question of how shifts like that occur by using his model. Instead, I went to a looser model from literary theory. It's not particularly impressive, but it gave me what I needed because it was a loose framework, and it comes from Stanley Fish, who uses the notion of interpretive communities. People ended up calling these discursive communities as well. And what he said was, he was talking about Milton, actually, in Paradise Lost, that readers create their own Milton, which is a bit of a strong statement because Milton kind of disappears. But the general notion is that there are communities that have shared interpretive strategies that distinguish meaning within a certain social group in a particular time and place. So it is both an intellectual framework because it's interpretive strategies and frameworks, but it's very historicist. It's very much in a time and place. it's a model that integrates intellectual and social history. Now, how can we characterize these discursive communities? Well, there are a number of very simple notions, right? Every one of these communities has a strategy of self-definition. They have border commitments. So this is, Bourdieu calls this entry conditions, but there are conditions to get in a community, and if you don't meet them, you are out. So there's always an inside-outside border. The borders can be relatively porous or relatively strict, but there is going to be a border to every community to give it identity. And secondly, once you're inside a community, once you've met the border commitments, there's going to be a range of interpretive variance. Some communities are going to be very strict about how much variance you can have within that community, and others will be more liberal, more tolerant. So Ludwig Fleck talks about thought collectives. Thought collectives have very little interpretive freedom once you enter them. It is dictated as to how you will interpret events. Other communities will have looser notions. And finally, discursive communities in psychoanalysis have a shared object of inquiry, or at least a shared method of inquiry. They share goals of that sort. So I'm going to now think about how Freud emerged as Freud, how the Freudians emerged as a community, and how ultimately they fell apart and reconstituted as a psychoanalytic community using this very loose framework of discursive communities. I'm going to be thinking about borders, I'm going to be thinking about interpretive variance, and I'm going to be thinking about what are the shared objects of inquiry and methods. And we'll see how this gives us a great deal of insight into how psychoanalysis was created. Okay, my book Revolution in Mind is divided into 3 sections. They're sequential, but they're also related. So the first is making Freudian theory, the second is making the Freudians, the third is making psychoanalysis. Making Freudian theory is an argument about the role of Sigmund Freud. And my argument is that he is neither a creative genius who only through his clinical encounters created this body of knowledge, nor is he an intellectual thief, but rather he's a quite brilliant interdisciplinary synthesist who enters 3 existing discursive communities, participates in their arguments, adopts a great deal of their language and conceptual frameworks, lock, stock, and barrel, comes up with syntheses to problems in those 3 disciplines that then allow him to pull together his own discipline. Let's talk about the 3 disciplinary communities that I focus on as being critical to the formation of Freudian theory and its core constructs. They are French psychopathology, biophysics, psychophysics, and sexology. Let's start with the French. The birth of scientific psychology in France can be rooted to the work of Théodule Ribot and La Psychologie Nouvelle from 1870. And Ribot, in creating an attempt at scientific psychology, had really 2 enemies. On the one hand, he had the work of Victor Cousin and the people who put supernatural notions of the soul into psychology. And he said, no, this is a naturalistic discipline. I'm going to try to make a scientific psychology. No notions of the soul. Okay, but now he has another problem on the other side. Auguste Comte has said, psychology can never be a science. It can never be objective. Why? Unless it abandons interior experience, which in a way behaviorists will end up doing. And in the process, they give up the psyche to create a psychology. He wasn't willing to do that. So he said he was going to try to manage this problem. And let's see. It's a problem that we still think about today. What did Comte say? After 2,000 years of psychological pursuit, no one proposition is established to the satisfaction of its followers. They are divided to this day into a multitude of schools, still disputing about the very elements of their doctrine. This interior observation gives birth to almost as many theories as there are observers. So how is he going to manage that problem? Well, he has a 3-tier strategy. The first part is he will allow for individual experience, and that will be analyzed through a very theoretically minimal associational psychology. Associational psychology from Hobbes and Locke and others simply says we track how perceptual information, ideational information, internal affects all form a web of associations. We see the animal, we hear moo, we learn the word vache or cow or whatever the word in Japanese is for cow, and we link all those together. And that's normal associative process. The pathology there, of course, is going to be dissociation. That's the first part, a theoretically minimal look at associations internally. Psychological functions, however, will be not explained in that way. They will be explained through heredity. So heredity is going to explain trans-individual issues through kind of genealogy. And the experimental arm of this program is going to be what Claude Bernard called nature's experiments, which is to say psychopathology. He believed you could look at psychopathology and infer back psychological function. So if we look at psychopathology, we can make inferences not just about psychopathology, but also about how the mind and the brain work. Now, this last part of Ribot's solution put him in touch with an array of neurologists and alienists, such as the famous Jean-Martin Charcot. Now, Charcot, in the beginning of his work, had no interest in psychology. He was an epiphenomenalist, which means he thought the mind had no causal power. So for a physician, it was of no interest. However, his views started to change as he became interested famously in hypnosis and hysteria. And without going through a lot of very well-trod terrain, I want to focus on one condition that I think was very critical to Sigmund Freud and to the changing model that Charcot had of the way ideas could be causal. And that is the notion of the traumatic paralyses. In the traumatic paralyses, you would hear a case history like this. A worker from a French construction site had been hit on the arm by a beam. He had the sudden shock of this beam striking him, associated that with a terrified thought, oh no, I can't move my arm. And then a few seconds later realized he could move his arm. He was fine. 3 days later, he approached the Salpêtrière. His arm was completely paralyzed. However, it was paralyzed in a manner that did not conform to anatomical distribution. That is to say, they knew it couldn't be a neurologic illness. So what was wrong with this man? His name was Pin. Well, they put together a rather complicated model, and it went like this. There was a trauma, the beam falling on this man, which shook his normal brain state. His first idea, I can't move my arm, was normally associated with the second idea, no, my arm is fine. But because of that trauma, they remained dissociated later on, so that the idea, I can't move my arm, created an imaginary paralysis. It functioned in the unconscious because it wasn't combated by that second associated idea. So there was a trauma, a dissociation, and an imaginary idea that had impact on the body, enough impact to give this man an imaginary paralysis. This is the beginning of a model that it combines psychogenesis in Charcot's thinking with something else, because he said this doesn't happen to normal people. This man, Pin, he is not a normal man. He has degenerative heredity. He has a brain that is not normal. Only in brains that are not normal does such a dissociation happen. But nonetheless, it is a mixed model that now includes ideas in the possibility of the cause of illness. Now, Sigmund Freud goes to the Salpêtrière, we know, in 1885, just when Charcot is working on the traumatic paralysis, and he sees these studies. He sees these patients. And he comes back to Vienna a changed man. He is setting up his private practice, and he is going to really be Charcot's representative in Vienna. He's gotten close to Charcot. He's convinced Charcot that he can be his German translator, although his French, frankly, is not very good. But nonetheless, he has adopted models of trauma, associational psychology, hypnosis, and psychogenesis. He is ready to set himself up as a French psychologist in Vienna of this school, just as French psychopathology starts to come undone. It is under attack, and it is under attack on two critical fronts. The two critical fronts are both heredity and its scientific status. Heredity is under attack because people like Charcot had been using degenerative heredity to explain almost everything. They've been very promiscuous in their use of it, and they would create these genealogies that had many different illnesses. All were supposedly due to degenerative heredity. And eventually this caught up with them. It caught up with them with GPI, general paralysis of the insane, and locomotor ataxia, both of which Charcot insisted were due to degenerative heredity, despite the fact that all of the evidence was starting to show they were due to syphilis, an environmental illness, an infectious illness. So the question became, if those are due to not degenerative heredity but something else, what about some of the other things, like hysteria, that Charcot said were due to degenerative heredity? What about the traumatic paralyses? How much has he overstated the impact of degenerative heredity? That's challenge number one. Challenge number two, perhaps you know about, which is Hippolyte Bernheim of the Nancy School's challenge to the Salpêtrière's notion that they were empirical observers of hysterial and hypnotic phenomenon. Empirical observers. He said they're not empirical observers. They're suggesting to the patients are suggesting back to them. It's a swirl of suggestion. Who knows where the first idea comes and the second ends, and that's why no one can reproduce Charcot's stages of hysteria and hypnosis outside of the Salpêtrière. He's created an institution that is hysterical, says Bernheim. So this is an attack on the very empirical basis of observation in this scientific psychology. Well, what's Freud going to do? He's attached himself to this school. He's opened up his practice. And now there's grave difficulty. What he's going to do, we're going to find him do again and again and again. I'm going to argue that it is characteristic of Sigmund Freud's way of thinking to figure out synthetic solutions that don't fully side with one nor the other, but open a middle path. And so what does he do? He says, he absolutely rejects Bernheim's notion that there is no way to be an empirical observer in these kinds of phenomena, and says, we will always have interpersonal dynamics, it's true, but a scientific psychology must look for the intrapsychic. It is not a matter of are we suggesting to them or they suggesting to us. That might be happening. But the critical question is, why are these people suggestible? Suggestibility is an internal trait. And so he takes the interpersonal and he winnows it down to a prior intrapsychic event. That is a move that Sigmund Freud is going to do for the rest of his life. He's going to say, there's this very complicated stuff happening there. Let's focus on what the intrapsychic conditions are for such an event. And then we'll be able to root it in an observed and an observer. Okay, that's one. He then also distances himself from Charcot's degenerative heredity. He says, no, degenerative heredity has been overstated. Sandra Gilman has shown that probably its anti-Semitic uses were part of Freud's discomfort. But it was something that he said, no, the degenerative heredity part is wrong, and we don't need it as part of our theory. Instead, that part of Charcot's theory, he says no, but this part of Charcot's theory, he says yes. I'm going to adopt the model from the traumatic paralyses and extend it to make it fully causal. The traumatic paralysis model works without degenerative heredity. In other words, a shock, a trauma, a dissociation, that can happen to all of us. And so, with that movement, for Charcot against Charcot, for Bernheim against Bernheim, you come up with a Freudian French model. It's still a very French model. It's part of French psychopathology. And when Breuer and Freud publish studies on hysteria in 1895, we see many, many elements that are really from French psychopathology. We see models of trauma, models of intrapsychic dissociation, models of psychogenesis. There are two central innovations in studies on hysteria. One is Breuer's cathartic method, which is absolutely an innovation. And the second is Freud's notion that traumatic ideas can become unconscious and cause hysteria due to psychic defense. Now, this is a very interesting idea. It's an idea about the mind regulating itself, the mind in some way protecting itself. It requires mental forces to have a mind that can defend itself. And Freud was, in proposing this, also proposing a puzzle. What kind of a mind does that? Now, if Freud had stopped at studies on hysteria, the French, who for the next 30 years would say that he ripped us off, would be absolutely right. Because much of what he did at this point came from the French tradition. But to answer that question, what kind of a mind can defend itself, Freud moved to a very different discourse. It was a German discourse. I call it biophysics, psychophysics, but we could also call it metaphysics, biophysics, and psychophysics, because it's a very German tradition that starts with German metaphysics and Immanuel Kant. To be very brief, Kant, of course, in the Critique on Pure Reason, starts to talk about transcendental a prioris that structure perceptual experience. For Kant, they're transcendental. However, he loses control of his own ideas almost immediately in Vienna, where Karl Reinhold and others misread him to be saying that they are a priori unconscious psychological conditions, not transcendental. And this gives rise to a number of theories known as subjective idealism. It's related to nature philosophy and romantic medicine. I don't want to get too deeply into this because it's very complicated, very interesting as well. That's Johann Ryle, the founder of something called psychiatry. He's the man who coined the term. And he and many of these others believe that there are mental forces, mental activity, that in a way could cause a mind to defend itself in conflict. Johannes Müller did a very important thing in this domain. He was the famous physiologist, and he discovered the law of specific energies of the senses, which said basically that if you stimulate the visual nerve with light or electricity or trauma, it always does the same thing. It sees light. That is to say, there's no light out there. It's all created in here. So he gave scientific ballast for these people who said mental causation is framing our understanding of the perceptual world. There are mind forces and mind forces in conflict. And so if Sigmund Freud in 1840 wanted a model of a mind that could defend itself the way he thought it did in hysteria, 1840 he would have had a lot of choices. But the problem was, in 1880, he had come after the reaction to that movement. The reaction to that movement was very, very powerful. It's called the biophysics movement of 1847. And for those of you who like kind of Oedipal stories, it is Johannes Müller's students who rebel against him, say there's no such thing as mind forces, there's no such thing as vital forces. Everything in nature can be explained by chemistry and physics. That's it. And they made a commitment to study natural phenomena, including the body and and biology, only through physics and chemistry. They also became the four most famous scientists in German science. They found one thing after another. Their method was very powerful for a while, and Dubois-Reymond, Brücke, Helmholtz, and Ludwig became the leading lights of German science. Now, this is the point where Frank Sulloway and a number of people get confused about the role of Sigmund Freud, because they note that Sigmund Freud was a student with Ernst Brücke, and they therefore say, well, he must have adopted this framework, but this framework eliminates the mind. It's very difficult to understand how a psychologist could adopt this framework. And in fact, what they miss is that by the time Freud came along, the biophysics movement had really run aground in a number of ways. But the most obvious way was anything that had to do with mind or psychology. The great Émile Dubois-Reymond came up with this notion of the 7 world mysteries. And he said the 7 world mysteries include things like human agency, intention, consciousness, free will. In other words, he said those are for a religion. Science can't explain those. And other people said, well, perhaps it's your kind of science that makes it difficult to at least approach those questions. We might need, as Ernst Haeckel said, a different kind of science. That different kind of science was psychophysics. Psychophysics, instead of being a reductionist program that eliminated the mind, said there is a mind, there are inner qualities and subjective experiences in a Newtonian world, in a physical world. We don't know how the two actually meet, but we can study the impact of one on the other. We can respect in a way that each of them exist. We don't know exactly how they come together. Dual aspect monism is the name of the mind-brain position. Dual aspect, even though it is monistic. And he said, I'm going to study outer psychophysics. He says there's probably inner psychophysics, but we don't know how to study it. Outer psychophysics I can study. External energies, internal qualities. What does that mean? There's a candle 400 yards away. Can you see it? No, I can't see it. 390 yards away. I can't see it. 380 degrees. I see it. He was interested in liminal experiences, on-off experiences, that he would then came up with a mathematical formula for how much energy was required for the qualitative experience of, let's say, this candle. And he then framed this in an interesting theory. His theory was that the quantitative experience of light was being qualitatively registered in the unconscious. But only once it met a certain threshold of energy did that unconscious qualitative experience become conscious. The idea was that we have evolved to not see every little bit of stimulation around us, but that there's an amount that we see that is not made conscious until it is so powerful that it reaches a threshold, and that's where we turn our attention. Now we turn to the tiger because we heard that noise, but we don't turn to every tiny little noise. So he has a model of energy, an unconscious, a conscious with a threshold. This is a model that becomes very exciting for people who want to study perception. And they include Hermann von Helmholtz, who uses this model of unconscious inference for vision, and people like Ewald Hering and his lab partner, Josef Breuer, who study hearing. Now, Freud's direct Viennese teachers in brain science were not using this model. They were, as I said, people like Brücke. And by the time Freud came back from France, they had all run off a cliff. They had taken their model and pushed it so far that it had become ridiculous. And they had become attacked for massively overstating what they could know. Brücke had written a physiology of poetry, which was ridiculous. Exner had written a physiology of ethics. He had been attacked by Breuer, saying you have no right to do this. This is not science. Meinert, Freud's psychiatry teacher, had taken a number of different functions and just stuck them in parts of the brain. William James made fun of him. Kraepelin made fun of him. It started to be a laughingstock. And yet, when Sigmund Freud sat down in 1895 after the studies on hysteria to try to contemplate a mind where defense could be possible, he used their model. He used biophysics. And that is the project for scientific psychology. The project for scientific psychology starts with Newtonian physics. The mind has to follow the rules of physics. It is wholly determined. And he uses a kind of neuron theory that's very close to what Meinert uses. Now, to be fair to Freud, the motor and the sensory neurons had just been isolated. So, in fact, it was very exciting that Kajal had said, okay, there are motor neurons, there are sensory neurons. And Freud thought, well, maybe there are memory neurons, perception neurons, and consciousness neurons. And I can put that all together into a really quite brilliant model of how the mind in a Newtonian world works. It was a model that followed biophysics in attempting to make a fully quantifiable model of the psyche. There was no psyche in this model. There was nothing that allowed for qualitative causal experience. And in fact, Freud put it away and thought afterwards it was a kind of madness. However, it was a dry run, I would suggest, for his next attempt at pulling together a mind-brain that was legitimate in terms of scientific discourse at the time and allowed for qualitative experience and the notion of an unconscious that could be defended against. And that was, of course, in chapter 7 of the Interpretation of Dreams. There, Freud does not try to reduce psychical events to physical quantities. The mind-brain approach is very much from psychophysics. There is a psychical world that's qualitative. There's a quantitative world. Paul Ricoeur is so brilliant that he, in his beautiful book on Freud and philosophy, recognizes this without understanding the history. He says, isn't this fascinating? Freud has put hermeneutics together with energetics. Well, this is why. It's a synthetic model that includes some of the biophysics assumptions into a psychophysics model. And here, the difference between Freud and Fechner is that intensity threshold alone is not what he uses. He says this is a threshold that is defended. That's going to be the model that allows him to think about psychical defenses. So here is the 1900 synthesis. Again, Freud thinking with and against, and coming up with a synthesis. Biophysics' commitment to Newtonian laws and the conservation of energy. Psychophysics as a model for psychical quality alongside and in functional relationship to quantities. And in that way, he has stabilized his object of study, the mind-brain, in a way that is materialistic, but also does not eliminate subjectivity, agency, intention. Now, one of the hanging questions that's left from the Interpretation of Dreams, if you've read it, is what is in this unconscious? It's clearly not just energetics from the external world. And Freud at one point says it's Kantian, it's a Ding an sich, it is unknowable. Which makes sense with his model, that the unconscious is kind of like the Ding an sich. But 5 years later, Freud is going to very specifically define what is in the unconscious, and in the process, open up the possibility for a new field. And that comes from his engagement with sexology. Now, doctors have been thinking about sexual trauma for a very long time, and I won't go into the debates about Freud and the seduction hypothesis, but as many of you know, in 1895, Freud began to consider sexual trauma as the cause of neurosis and anxiety, neurosis and neurasthenia, etc. And in doing so, he comes up with this, I think, very important formulation. He says hysteria is the negative of perversion. By that he means perversion, which are empirical acts that we can observe, are exactly the same as the thoughts that the hysteric has in their unconscious. Therefore, we have an empirical, indirect manner of observing what might be in the hysterical unconscious if we study sexual perversion. Now, by chance, the head of Freud's department was the most important sexologist studying sexual perversion at that time, and that's Richard von Krafft-Ebing. The emergence of sexual science is a very interesting history. I won't talk about it today. I simply want to say that by the time Freud enters these studies in the 1880s and 1890s, sexology is split between essentially two schools. This is a bit crude what I'm about to say, but it'll allow me to be a little cartoonish. There are a group of people who think degenerative heredity dictates sexual choices. I call those mindless bodies. And they're a group that say that a stray association, you saw your mother's shoe, you developed a foot fetish at the age of 5, a stray association, bodiless minds, creates your sexual desire. And again, I would like to suggest that Freud comes up with a synthetic position between these two overstated positions. And this is a synthetic position that resolves a bunch of problems from his other two engagements, so it actually opens the possibility for a grand synthesis, and that is his highly theorized notion of what seems very simple, psychosexuality. He links psycho and sexuality. And what does that do for him? It pulls together a bunch of different fields. Now, hysteria, the traumatizing ideas, come from libido. The source of the unconscious, the Kantian Ding an sich before, it is now defined as unconscious libido. And sexual difference, it's not due to degeneration or stray association, but it is a psychobiological development based on psychosexuality. So with this one concept, he now has a way of organizing all of those other fields in a different way. He offers a link between reason and passion, mind and body, individual and species, the human and the animal. He finds a way to organize his field so that it can exist alongside Newton and Darwin and positivists. And all of this is organized around this notion of Freudian psychosexuality. Now, the power of this model is not just that it explains how Freud went about building the intellectual apparatus for Freudian theory, but it also then helps us understand how the Freudians then emerged. This is the second section of my book called Making the Freudians. Because what we find is, from these three other disciplines, Freud inherits a great number of allies and a great number of enemies. This is how they come to him. He wins new followers because, let's say you're a German or Austrian French-style psychopathologist, well, you're anti-French, so you would rather be a Freudian, right? If you're a scientist of the psyche, you want to be a scientist, even though you got your MD and you've been tossed out into private practice, you can become a Freudian. If you're a sexologist who wants to have ways of actually clinically treating patients, you could become a Freudian. So in this way, I say that Freud did not so much create a revolution as take control of one that was already in progress. All of these other people who were trying to find new ways of mind and illness come through these disciplines to Freud. Now, he also inherits all the enemies of those prior disciplines. So the neuropsychiatrists who hated French psychopathology hate Freud. The biophysicists who reject the notion that the mind has a causal power reject Freud. The people who are horrified by sexology are horrified by Freud. In addition, Freud makes some of his own enemies. The French believed he was ripping them off, and they said so for the next 30 years. Academic psychologists were appalled by some of Freud's uses of sexuality, and biological-oriented sexologists rejected his notion of the mind. So as you see, he has instant out friends and enemies. Let's examine this more closely. These are the first followers that come to Freud from the University of Vienna Medical School. These are doctors who are looking for something therapeutic, something they can do. They have very few tools. They have water cures, they have things that have been really, are laughing stocks in the community. They need a therapeutic tool. And they become interested in the French because the French offer the possibility of therapeutic power. And so a number of these people, and you'll see these are the top row are very senior professors at the University of Vienna Medical School. The F means that they've done something very significant that engaged with the French. So von Krafft-Ebing, Nothnagel, they then train an array of students who are going to become core to the Freudian movement. You see Adler, Federn, Hitchman, Steckel, Kahan. The second group don't come from the medical school. They're not so interested in French psychopathology. They are advocates of sexual reform. They say that the sexual mores of Catholic Vienna are making people repressed and ill. They want to be physicians to a sick culture. And they learn about Freud's sexology, his notion of sexual repression, and they see it as a scientific justification for their political views. So they come to him as well. And they can be the writers like von Hofmannsthal and Schnitzler, Graf, Bach. These people come to the first Viennese community. The sexual ethicists like Weininger, Ehrenfels. These people all start to become very interested in Sigmund Freud, not so interested in French psychopathology. They're interested in the sexual part of psychosexuality. Now, as the Viennese community is forming, another very powerful community starts to form, and that is the one in Zurich. That's Eugen Bleuler. He's the leader of the Zurich Freudians. And unlike the Viennese, who are really on the outskirts of academic medicine, really peripheral in many ways, Eugen Bleuler is a very powerful academic professor. And he brings the power of a university with research facilities and training facilities to the Freudians for the first time. So he and his community are mostly interested in the psychoses rather than the neuroses, which the Viennese treated. They were mostly in private practice. These were academic psychiatrists who had labs that started to do studies on Freudian ideas faithfully, studies on Freudian ideas that were the same methods, association tests that Wundt and Kraepelin were using. They were Protestant. The Viennese were almost exclusively Jewish. And they had some overlap, which is that they were both interested in French psychopathology. They were both interested in the dream book. But the Viennese and the Zurichers differed about sexology. The Zurichers were very, very reluctant to accept the Viennese notions of sexuality. So there was a difference there. The point was, at this point, it didn't matter. The Freudians in 1908 were a very broad community with very porous boundary conditions. The boundary conditions was you had to be interested in something that was Freudian, anything. But there was no strict litmus test. So there were an array of reformers, sexologists, psychotherapists, partial Freudians, as Ferenczi called them, who ranged from Bleuler, who was a strict Protestant academic, to Otto Gross, who was an anarchist, cocaine-using revolutionary. They were all in. If you were interested in anything, that was enough. Psycho, some were interested in the psycho, not so interested in the sexual. Sexual, some were interested in the sexual, not so interested in the psychology. The two main centers were in Vienna and Zurich, and critically, international followers were being minted in Zurich. Students, medical students, were coming to Zurich and leaving as Freudians. So those include Ernest Jones, Eitingen, Abraham, Brill, Ferenczi. They all have gone through Zurich. It is critical to the international movement. The Viennese have no department of psychiatry. They have no clinical facilities. They're all in private practice. Now, this new scientific credibility that Zurich brings to the movement especially comes through Jung's association tests, where he says, I'm using the method of the academic psychiatrists, and through your method, I'm showing that Freudian ideas actually are reliable and valid, and therefore scientifically acceptable. And this unleashed a great number of attacks from German academic psychiatrists, who prior to this really thought the Freudians were beneath their consideration. And these attacks created what one might call, in retrospect, a kind of paranoid reaction. Because the Freudians decided that 1910 they would utterly change the community, the discursive community that they were in. They created the International Psychoanalytic Association as a defense organization, and they said the border conditions are now, you have to fully accept Freudian psychosexuality to be in, otherwise you're out. You have to fully accept being a Freudian, following Sigmund Freud in toto, or you're out. The goal, they said, was to defend themselves against internal and external enemies, but the result was something quite different. What happened after Nuremberg in 1910 was that instead of defending and unifying the Freudian community, it fractured and split. And this is the famous schisms that are often spoken about by Adler, Stekel, and Jung. But actually, the first and most important one was the departure of Eugen Bleuler. Eugen Bleuler said, I cannot accept this. This is not the way science works. I need to be able to have interpretive variance, even if I use your methods. And I'm so sorry, but I'm out. Which meant that in one fell swoop, these fledgling Freudians lost their only academic center, their only research center. Soon thereafter, the most prominent theoreticians, Adler, Stekel, and Jung, also leave. And so psychoanalysis circa 1914 looks very different than it did in 1908. The founding of the IPA, which was supposed to pull together the ranks, fragmented them into different schools, each of which had claims about the unconscious that were stabilized by the authority of a charismatic leader. So Jung would leave, he would start analytic psychology, he would have claims about the unconscious. Stekel never really had a school. Adler, though, did, and he would have claims about the unconscious. And Freud did, and he and his IPA colleagues would be, simply it seemed at that point, destined to be one of a number of small schools, all of whom had their gurus, and that would be it. Now, most histories skip from here, 1914, to 1980 in New York. And they say, oh, you see, it's always been like this, or or maybe 1980 in London, or in Paris. It's always been like this. The psychoanalysts are always like this. And in fact, what we find is there's a very interesting chapter that comes after this chapter. And it is a reframing of the field from Freudian to psychoanalytic. Let me take you through that right now. Before a truly psychoanalytic field emerges, the Freudian field collapses. What happens is everything stops in World War I. There are no more activities. The war overwhelms everything. But when the psychoanalysts reemerge in 1918, they are focused on the question of the war neuroses. And the war neuroses, for some academic psychiatrists, are the death knell of Freudian thought. They say, look, how can you possibly explain the war neuroses with libido? How can this possibly all be due to Oedipal competition or anal sadism? How can all of the aggression of World War I, all of these millions dead, be due to anal sadism? It makes no sense. And some begin to think, even in the Freudian community, maybe Adler and Stekel were right. Maybe there is a primary aggressive thought, drive. But that doesn't really matter until Sigmund Freud says that. In 1919, Sigmund Freud publishes Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he introduces the death drive to the unconscious. And he highlights that this is a speculative theory. Now you have to imagine, you've just gone to war with some of your best friends. You've become utterly ostracized from them. The Adlerians, Stekel, the Zurichers, you've gone to war over the idea that the only thing in the unconscious is sexual libido. And that's because Sigmund Freud says so. You believe it too, but the authority comes from Sigmund Freud. And then he says, maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong. It was utterly shocking. It was utterly shocking. Max Eichengen said about Freud, he has put dynamite in the Freudian house. We had constructed this community around a core belief, and now he says, but we should think about maybe there's another thing going on there. And this created a great deal of dissension in his community. Older members rejected the death drive. Soon leftists would reject the death drive too because it had political connotations. And really fundamentally what Beyond the Pleasure Principle did was it undermined the notion that you just had to be a Freudian to be part of this community, because now there were too many Freuds. Now there were Freuds that were posed against each other. Being a Freudian could no longer be the defining element of this community. And so, wittingly or not, Freud undermined his own authority as leader of a school, and as we will see in the next 15 years, Freud would be opposed and rejected on a series of defining matters as psychoanalysis came to be dominated not so much by a man, but rather by four powerful communities in London, Berlin, Budapest, and Vienna, all of whom would struggle to figure out how can we stabilize a psychoanalytic community. The first attempt to try to do this was a failed one, but it would have legs and be followed up on later on, and that was the notion that Ferenczi and Rank said, if we share the same technique, that can be the border condition. If we all analyze transference and resistance, then you can decide what you find in the unconscious after that. You're still a psychoanalyst. They were against the notion of analytic treatment that was deep interpretation of theory before you even met the patient, right? The joke would be, that the patient came in and you were just waiting to tell them about their Oedipal complex because you already knew that in advance. And they said, no, we must share at least the same technique, and then if one comes to the notion of a death drive, if the other comes to a notion of a libido, whatever, that should be interpretive variance, freedom there. Now, the problem was that Ferenczi and Rank put together this model of theoretical restraint and scientific credibility as they both published two of the most speculative works that psychoanalysis had ever seen. And so, in a way, they undermined their own efforts. But this would be a recurrent idea that came back. Wilhelm Reich would use it, Anna Freud would use it. The idea is we stabilize our field by a common method. And then what you find through that method is allows for scientific variability. The second great movement to stabilize psychoanalysis was professionalization, of course. And the Berliners were the ones who did this. In Berlin, they opened the first clinic, the first training program, the famous rules for your own analysis, supervised analysis, and classes training become established by the IPA. And in Berlin, they're very aggressive about the notion that we are not Freudians. We are psychoanalytic scientists. And in so doing, they oppose some of Freud's ideas about femininity, and that's Karen Horney's important work on male bias. And they start to talk about the fact that neurosis alone does not give us enough impact on our patients. We have to start thinking about character analysis, character pathology. And Abraham and Alexander are going to be very important in this. It's going to be picked up in Vienna, at the Vienna Technical Seminars. I won't go on about the Vienna Technical Seminars. They're very interesting. They're run by Wilhelm Reich. They're very, very important because they establish the notion of character armor, and remembering by itself does not cure. Catharsis in this sense does not cure. We have to analyze at the level of latent negative transferences which are consolidated into character. And this is going to be an important movement for the Viennese. Now, this is all to say that between 1920 and 1933, there is an explosion of ideas in psychoanalysis in these four different centers, but also elsewhere. And that starts to come to a close in 1933 when the Nazis, of course, take over Berlin, and the Berlin psychoanalytic community is Aryanized and destroyed. The Berlin elite leave, they go to America, Palestine, Wilhelm Reich has to go on the run. And in 1934, as you take a look at the span of issues in psychoanalysis, you see that there are multiple theories of mind. There are multiple theories of the unconscious. There are multiple theories of technique. And now also Ferenczi, who is the leader of, he's not just the leader, he's kind of the head and the shoulders and the body of the Hungarian movement, has died. So now with Berlin collapsed and Budapest, the great loss in Budapest, there really is London and Vienna as the two major centers for psychoanalysis, and all of these ideas floating around. And over the next 4 years, I would argue that two schools emerged that tried to build on the notions of how to stabilize a psychoanalytic field by turning to the empirical observation of children. And those are the movements in London and Vienna, Melanie Klein and Anna Freud. Melanie Klein, as many of you know, was an early child analyst. She was an acolyte and analysand of Ferenczi's. Then she went to Berlin before Jones brought her to London. She devoted herself to the study of children, and while Freud and others reconstructed what happened in childhood from an adult, she observed what was happening with children in her analytic room. So she had an empirical kind of validation of what childhood experience and trauma and defense looked like, that added a stabilizing quality to her work. She was opposed, as we know famously, by the Vienna School and Anna Freud, and if Melanie Klein was attacked for being unscientific, Anna Freud was attacked for not being an analyst. So these were kind of unpleasant fights between these communities. She too banked on empirical child treatment and research in Vienna, and she too pulled together an organizing way of synthesizing the many different disparate elements of the psychoanalytic community. Hers was, of course, based around I or ego psychology, with the notion being that everything flows ultimately through its most empirical, empirical manifestation, and that is through the ego. And so if we all start analyzing from the ego, we can analyze anywhere you want. We'll all be psychoanalysts. Okay, so psychoanalysis, and I'm about to finish, in 1938, has a very different discursive community than it did in 1914. The border commitments now are common technique, professional training, increased dependence on empiricism and child observation. There is a great deal of emphasis on transference analysis, and in all but the Kleinian communities, there's no litmus test for a commitment to a theory of the unconscious. Unfortunately, in 1938, the Viennese community also is about to be destroyed, and that is by the invasion of the Nazis with the Anschluss, and Sigmund Freud then dies in 1939. World War II begins. And with that, the exile of European psychoanalysis takes it to two major centers, which is New York and London, and re-engenders the question, are we Freudians, part of a Freudian discursive community, or are we analysts, part of a psychoanalytic community? And these become very bitter battles that often pit the ex-Berliners, who are in favor of the psychoanalytic, against Viennese, who argue that they are Freud's heirs. In London and in New York, the psychoanalytic communities fracture, but mostly do not break. Sylvia Payne orchestrates the Great British Compromise, and the Viennese take over the New York Psychoanalytic. Rado leaves to form the group at Columbia, and Karen Horney secedes. And so, in conclusion, we study the history of the origins of Freudian thought, the emergence of the Freudians, and the emergence of psychoanalysis as a field. We find it is far from the biography of one man, but rather more of a history that could be told like an opera, with different contested ideas emerging from competing intellectual communities as they enter and exit the historical stage. A fundamental question runs throughout this history. How can one stabilize a science of subjectivity? Charismatic authority an enforced commitment to unprovable truths that are so disturbing that they must be protected, common modes of investigation, a common process of professionalization, or a commitment to empiricism? The question, I think, remains a pressing one for us today. Thank you very, very much for your time.